America's greatest TV show of recent times is one of familial betrayal, corporate treachery, sexual scandal, and succession. I am, of course, talking about Monday Night Raw. Chapter 1. Marking the Territory. The story of the McMahon family doesn't begin with Vincent Kennedy McMahon putting on WrestleMania 1. It doesn't even start with his father, Vincent James McMahon. Instead, it starts with Vincent's granddad. That's Vinny K's granddad, or Vinny J's dad. Yeah, Roderick James Jess McMahon. No idea why he was called Jess. Jess McMahon was born in 1882 in Queens, New York City, as the son of hotel owner Roderick McMahon and his wife Elizabeth, who were a pair of Irish immigrants from County Galway. After getting a commercial diploma from Manhattan College at age 17, Jess and his brother Edward took that business knowledge and took it into sports. In the early 1900s, they became managing partners of the Olympic Athletic Club, a semi-professional football team. They founded the New York Lincoln Giants, a black baseball team who played at Harlem's Olympic Field, and started a black professional basketball team, the Commonwealth Big Five. The McMahon brothers had football, baseball, and basketball teams to their name, but it was a different sport where Jess would gain notoriety. Boxing. Because of his links with Harlem, Jess was able to book black fighters to cater to the growing black population, with fights between black and white fighters drawing the largest, most racially mixed crowds. Jess McMahon was seen as a real fighters promoter, a promoter who booked boxers based on how skilled they were, not because of the colour of their skin. And he was so successful, Jess became the official matchmaker for Madison Square Garden, starting a McMahon family connection with the famous venue that would last the better part of a century. And in 1932, he started another family lineage: professional wrestling. The McMahon family's first ever professional wrestling event took place at the Municipal Stadium in Freeport. The New York territory in those days was a rough place to get started, with other promoters fiercely protective of their turf, but Jess knew the right people and was able to book the top stars at the time. But it took 20 years for him to go from booker to owner. In 1952, Jess created the Capital Wrestling Corporation with the pro wrestler Joseph Raymond Toots Mond and Vince McMahon. Vincent J. McMahon, that is, although he looked like it for a bit when he had that moustache. Our generation's Vince McMahon isn't 100 years old. Vincent J. McMahon was born in 1914. And once he was done serving as a Coast Guard during World War II, he officially made promoting a family business. He helped his dad book boxing and concerts, but it was pro wrestling that really captured his imagination. Because just like his son would see the potential for the new invention of pay-per-view distribution decades later, Vinny J saw a gap in the market for pro wrestling on this new thing called television, a burgeoning industry that needed content on its screens. So in the mid-1950s, Vincent J bought a wrestling venue called Turner's Arena for $60,000, which in today's money is around $700,000, and he renamed it the Capitol Arena for brand synergy with Capital Wrestling Corporation, which is what modern-day WWE NXT's main arena, the Capital Wrestling Center, is named after. On Thursday, the 5th of January 1956, the first ever televised wrestling event from a McMahon took place. The show was a hit, and it got Vincent a Capital Wrestling TV deal for a weekly 2-hour live event broadcast in 11 states. Capital Wrestling would become affiliated with the National Wrestling Alliance, a collection of powerful wrestling promotions across the country who shared a singular world champion. I'm sure introducing the McMahon family will never backfire on them. And it was around this time Vincent reconciled with the 12-year-old son he had left when he was just a few months old. Despite somehow managing to create a near monopoly within the NWA's actual monopoly, with Vincent and Toots controlling almost 70% of the organization's booking decisions, them and the CWC broke away when their top star Buddy Rogers was booked to lose the NWA World Heavyweight Championship to Lou Thesz. Despite losing the belt, Vincent and Toots kept promoting Rogers as the NWA champion until they awarded him the inaugural belt of the CWC's rebrand, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation World Heavyweight Championship, aka the WWF. They rejoined the NWA in 1971, and by 1979 they dropped the "wide" from their name, making it far easier to say World Wrestling Federation or WWF, a rebranding that was the idea of that son he reconciled with 25 years before, who was also called Vince. Before we go any further, thank you so much to all the people behind the scenes who helped make this video. It's not just me, although I do pretty much everything around here. It's Kelly, it's Pete, it's Ellis, it's Brandon, so many talented, so many expensive people, which is why we couldn't do these videos without the support of all of you on Patreon. If you like our content, please consider signing up over there on patreon.com/WrestleTalk, where you'll also get loads of exclusive video content, like WrestleTalk Extra, that's where Luke and I do a deep dive into wrestling history, and survival series Thunderdome, a remote version of everyone's favourite wrestling trivia show. That's patreon.com/WrestleTalk. Chapter 2. Becoming a Titan. Vince Jr., aka Vincent Kennedy McMahon, the one we know worst, had a rough childhood. His father left his mother Victoria when he was just a few months old, taking his older brother with him. Vince instead lived with Victoria's various partners, including Leo Lupton, who was physically abusive to both of them. Vince would later say he regrets that Lupton died before he could kill him. Although Vincent J re-entered his life when Vince Jr. was 12, they had a strained relationship, with Vince Jr. being sent to military school. Vince wanted to become a wrestler, but his dad shot him down, explaining how the wrestling business worked. Promoters don't appear on their own shows. They should stay separate from the wrestlers themselves. Vince would, of course, go on to become one of the most infamous on-screen wrestling characters of all time. Not all fatherly advice is good. I don't know what to tell you. Vince graduated from East Carolina University with a business degree in 1968. By the following year, he made his wrestling debut as a ring announcer for the WWF. He had to wait until 1971 to get his first proper break. Vincent J didn't seem to want his son in the wrestling business, but one of his promoters in Maine had just been caught stealing and let go, so he sent Vince down to run it, promising his son this would be his first and last opportunity he'd ever get in this industry. He was right, but probably not in the way he intended. Vince started promoting wrestling cards and very quickly took up play-by-play commentary, which he'd keep doing for the next 25 years and somehow still didn't know the names of moves. What a maneuver! Years before properly getting into the wrestling business, Vince had married his childhood sweetheart, Linda McMahon, in 1966, where they had financially turbulent beginnings, filing for bankruptcy in 1976, mostly because of 5 years of unpaid taxes and $1 million worth of debt Vince had from promoting Evel Knievel botching trying to jump Snake River Canyon. 3, 2, 1. Yep, there goes Evel there, flying up and immediately firing the parachute, plummeting back down to earth, barely having cleared the side of the canyon he was jumping from. Bouncing back, Vince and Linda founded Titan Sports in 1979, and 3 years later, they bought his retiring father's WWF stock. Even with Vincent J's decline in health though, he still didn't trust his own son. He hadn't wanted him to be a wrestler, didn't want him to be a promoter, and kept shutting down Vince's aggressive expansion plans because it would ruin their relationship with the NWA. So even when leaving the company, he hedged his bets. To make sure Vince didn't have full control, Vincent J kept Arnold Scarland Phil Zacco and Robert Morella, better known to fans as Gorilla Monsoon, with percentages in the business. Vince has no time for checks and balances though, and bought them all out with his own money, becoming the full CEO of the World Wrestling Federation. And when his father passed away 2 years later in 1984, his reported wish wanting the WWF to remain as a northeastern promotion, Vince Jr. pushed through his own plans, destroying the territories. He took the WWF out of the NWA in 1983 and began signing other promotions' top stars with promises of national exposure on syndicated TV and bigger paydays. He took Hulk Hogan, Jesse Ventura, Bobby Heenan and Mean Gene Okerlund from the AWA, which would consequently go out of business in 1991, and he got Roddy Piper, Greg Valentine and Ricky Steamboat from Jim Crockett Promotions, which was defunct by 1988. Vince said in a 1991 interview with Sports Illustrated, he knew exactly what he was doing. Had my father known what I was going to do, he never would have sold his stock to me. In the old days, there were wrestling fiefdoms all over the country, each with its own little lord in charge. Each little lord respected the rights of his neighbouring little lord. No takeovers or raids were allowed. There were maybe 30 of these tiny kingdoms in the US, and if I hadn't bought out my dad, there would still be 30 of them, fragmented and struggling. I, of course, had no allegiance to those little lords. Still, even after signing all this top talent and having nationwide TV exposure, he needed to take a huge gamble to break through to the mainstream. Taking the Super Show concept of NWA Starrcade and crossing it over with celebrities like Mr. T, Cyndi Lauper, Muhammad Ali, Liberace and MLB manager Billy Martin, 1985's WrestleMania established the pay-per-view model as a fundamental part of the wrestling business and popularized the means of distribution across the country. Because before WrestleMania, shows like Starrcade were broadcast on CCTV, which isn't loads of tiny security cameras. CCTV stands for Closed Circuit Television, and was how most people would watch big boxing matches like the Rumble in the Jungle or the Thriller in Manila in the 60s and 70s. But rather than ordering it on the phone and watching it at home, you would go to a theatre, buy a ticket, and watch it there. And 1 million people still watched WrestleMania this way, because it was also available on pay-per-view in people's homes. McMahon made watching WrestleMania unprecedentedly accessible. To this day, McMahon owns payperview.com. He literally owns the website, which just reroutes to the WWE network. WrestleMania's performance made McMahon the most successful promoter in the country, making his WWF the #1 promotion with no serious competitors for over a decade. Instead, the greatest threat to himself and his business was Vince. Chapter 3: The Steroid Trial. In 1991, Dr. George Sahorian III was convicted of illegally supplying anabolic steroids. During his trial, it came out, while working as a ringside doctor, he supplied steroids to the WWF, specifically to Vince himself in his office at Titan Towers. 2 years later, Vince was indicted and charged with conspiring to distribute steroids, possession of illegal steroids with intent to distribute, and embezzlement for allegedly using money from Titan Sports Inc. to purchase illegal steroids. If Vince was found guilty, he was looking at up to 8 years in prison. This trial would be known as United States versus McMahon. Not a wrestling match. With a very real chance of going to jail for the first time ever, Vince had to think about who would run the WWF in his place. He decided Linda could handle the business day-to-day runnings, but for the creative side of the company, he'd need to go back to his dad's advice. Vince Sr. had once told Vince Jr. that if he ever needed anything in the wrestling business, the person to call is his close friend, Jerry Jarrett. The father of Jeff Jarrett was the wrestling genius behind Jerry Lawler and the Memphis-based Continental Wrestling Association. He initially turned Vince down, but was eventually brought into WWF as a consultant under the guise that he'd take over creative if McMahon was found guilty. Vince was cleared due to insufficient evidence, so Jerry immediately requested his release from WWF, which Vince not only granted, he also paid the entirety of the remainder of Jerry's 3-year contract as a thank you for stepping in when things got rough. But this close call was the first time Vince had to seriously and practically consider the process of succession, and how he was ill-prepared to keep this a family business. So enter the 4th generation of Wrestling McMahons. Chapter 4. To be the McMahon. Vince had 2 children with Linda, Shane, born in 1970, and Stephanie, born 6 years later in 1976. Unlike Vince's own dad, he got them working the family business as soon as he could. From the age of 15, Shane worked in the warehouse on merch orders, he worked as a referee in the ring, a producer, an announcer, and when he was 27, he spearheaded the launch of WWF's first official website in 1997. Stephanie, meanwhile, started as a model for WWF's sale and merchandise department before becoming an account executive for the WWF offices in New York. But again, going against his own father's advice, Vince didn't just have his children working behind the scenes. He also used them as on-screen characters throughout the late 90s onwards, including one thankfully scrapped incest storyline where either Vince or Shane was going to be the kayfabe father of Stephanie's real-life baby. As the noughties developed, Vince integrated Shane and Stephanie more and more in the creative and business aspects of the company. They were being positioned to take over WWE when, if Vince ever retired. But the McMahons appeared to mistake family business succession with building a wrestling match feud, in which there can only be one winner and one loser. Vince would often play his employees, wrestlers, and children off one another, fostering a ruthless corporate culture. Shane took the early lead, helping close big TV deals in Mexico and Brazil, founding his own fintech company called China Broadband, and strongly pitching 2 ideas that were genuinely ahead of their time. Seeing the potential of the UFC in the early 2000s, when it was a fraction of the size it is today, Shane pushed his father to buy the MMA promotion, but Vince shot it down. 2 decades later, UFC would merge with WWE as an equal in TKO Group Holdings. And in 2006, 8 years before the WWE Network and even a year before the launch of Netflix, Shane wanted to bring back ECW as an online-only show, catering to literally hardcore wrestling fans on the internet. Vince overruled him, relaunching the promotion on traditional TV as WWECW, which was awful. Whereas his grandfather had seen the potential of television and Vince had grabbed the mainstream power of pay-per-view, Shane could have been a 3rd-generation innovator in wrestling distribution. Instead, in 2010, it was suddenly announced that effective immediately on January 1st, Shane McMahon would be leaving WWE. With Vince's wife Linda having resigned as the company's CEO to pursue a career in politics just a few months beforehand, Vince and Stephanie, Daddy and Daddy's little girl, became the only McMahons in WWE. There was never an official explanation for Shane's departure, but in a 2016 interview with Mick Foley, Shane said it was because the business was no longer fun, and he felt his ideas weren't being listened to, because Shane had found himself in a handicap match with WWE's other power faction behind the scenes, his sister and her boyfriend Paul. While Shane focused predominantly on WWE's business development, Stephanie slowly took over the company creative. She replaced experienced TV writer Chris Kresge in November 2000 as head writer, despite only being in her mid-20s, and was promoted to senior vice president of creative writing in 2006, a period that just so happened to coincide with Triple H's reign of terror. The two began dating in 2000, following their romance storyline on screen, and they got married in 2003. Even though Triple H didn't have an official backstage title, he was rumoured to influence creative decisions. For the Succession fans amongst you, he's Tom. Perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, Triple H's behind-the-scenes role was made official the same year Shane officially left. He was first made Executive Senior Advisor, then the following year took over as Executive Vice President, Talent and Live Events from longtime Talent Relations Head John Laurinaitis. By 2013, they added Creative to his Vice President title, giving him control over WWE's creative direction. It seemed Vince had chosen his successors, the power couple of Stephanie McMahon and Paul Levesque. Levesque was even given his own promotion, NXT, to one day prepare him for taking over WWE. But they had a powerful enemy who was closer to Vince than almost anyone. Kevin Dunn! Give me the crash zooms right now! Kevin Dunn was WWE's Executive Vice President of Production and Vince's right-hand man for 3 decades. Perhaps seeing them as a threat, he never took to Stephanie and Triple H in the same way he did for Shane, and the feeling was seemingly mutual. Despite their growing power backstage, Stephanie and Trips couldn't control Dunn, and when business started to take a downturn in 2012, Dunn struck. Kevin Dunn reportedly set up a meeting with himself, Vince, businessman and author James Frey, and Shane, who had been gone from the company for 2 years, where he was now the CEO of You On Demand, China's first VOD and pay-per-view service. In that meeting, Shane allegedly pitched the solution to WWE's declining ratings. He'd take over all the creative, including the writer's room. Apparently, when Stephanie found out about the meeting, she went white in the face while Triple H freaked out. But once again, Vince shot Shane down. For now. Stephanie and Triple H were not just enjoying behind-the-scenes power, they had it on screen too, running WWE as the authority faction, trying to recapture Vince McMahon's heel authority figure antagonist from 15 years previously. But ratings still kept falling, fans were growing frustrated, and everyone had just decided they didn't like WWE's next top star, Roman Reigns, anymore. So in 2016, maybe remembering that 2012 meeting, Shane returned to WWE in one of the most psychologically loaded McMahon segments ever. Vince was about to present the Vincent James McMahon Legacy of Excellence Award, an award named after his father, to his daughter Stephanie. They were then interrupted by the returning Shane, who told Vince he knew his secrets, that Vince had covered a lot of things up, and he knows about the lockbox, which is super weird in retrospect. The MacGuffin of the lockbox was, like many other things at the time, then completely dropped and never followed up on. Shane then faced The Undertaker at WrestleMania 32 for control of Monday Night Raw, lost, and gained control of Raw anyway. Shane said he was only back in the family business purely so his children could see him wrestle and not for any political power grabs backstage. By 2019, he was a producer again, and by 2022, he was booking the Men's Royal Rumble match. But oh, Icarus, you climbed too far up the Titantron. That match is considered one of the worst Rumbles in history, mostly because Shane created chaos, had everyone in an uproar, pissed off everyone in the Rumble, openly buried other producers, and was changing things that Vince wanted. Several days later, Vince fired his own son from the family business. But that was the least of the problems the McMahons would face in 2022. Chapter 5. The Fall. In June 2022, Vince McMahon stepped down as the CEO and chairman of WWE due to mounting allegations of sexual misconduct. The Wall Street Journal had reported WWE's own board was investigating Vince over hush money payments to multiple female employees. These totaled just shy of $20 million between 2006 and 2022. He kept hold of his creative booking duties because wrestling is wrestling was cheered one night when he came out defiant on an episode of SmackDown, but he ultimately resigned the following month. For the first time in over 40 years, Vince McMahon was no longer in wrestling. In his absence, the McMahon, Helmsley, and now also Nick Khan power trio took control of WWE. Stephanie and Khan were named co-CEOs, while Triple H became Chief Content Officer, which is essentially the head booker. It might not have been the steady succession the company would have hoped for, but WWE had successfully gone from father to daughter, while the creative became the best it had done in years. But just one more thing. Vince McMahon forced his way back in control just 6 months later. Vince might have resigned as chairman and CEO, but he still majority owned the company, a position he used to block any potential sale of WWE unless they brought him back. So in January 2023, in a corporate coup, Vince bulldozed his way back onto the board and reinstated himself as its chairman, where he replaced many of those who had blocked another attempted return the previous month, like his own daughter. Just several days later, Stephanie McMahon resigned from her position and left the company entirely. Nick Khan and her husband Triple H stayed on. In that half a year out, Vince had an opportunity to keep WWE a family business, which could have continued, maybe even thrived, under his own daughter Stephanie as CEO. But like he once said about the NWO, if anyone was going to kill his creation, he's going to be the one to do it. Because really, Vince screwed the McMahon family out of WWE. On April 3rd, 2023, Vince, along with Dana White and Ari Emanuel, announced a merger between WWE and UFC to form TKO, which would be owned by Endeavor in a deal worth $21 billion. But crucially, Emanuel promised Vince McMahon would still be in control of WWE. It turned out to be a Faustian bargain, because after all the paperwork was completed and the merger was finalized in September, Vince became more and more isolated from the WWE he fired his own son and daughter from to keep control of. Maybe it was because Ari secretly thought Vince was past it. Maybe Nick Khan was plotting to bring his friend The Rock in all along. Maybe Endeavor, just like their public SEC filing laid out, identified McMahon as a threat to their own business on account of those sexual misconduct allegations. On the 25th of January 2024, a lawsuit was filed against Vince McMahon, accusing him of physically, emotionally, and sexually abusing a past employee, as well as trafficking her to other people. Vince denied the allegations, but nevertheless, on the very next day, he resigned from WWE for the second time. But this time was different. This was in a post-merger world. There was no take-back clause, no legal mechanism for Vince to return to power, which meant that January 26th marked the last time Vince McMahon would ever work for WWE again, which also meant that for the first time ever in its history, the WWE, the WWF, the WWF, or even CWC, the company no longer had one of the 4 generations of McMahon in official positions. No more Jess, no more Vincent, no more Linda, no more Stephanie, no more Shane, no more Vince. In fact, wrestling has more than one royal family, and with The Rock and Roman Reigns, it seems like they're taking over WWE instead. Watch my video breaking down the fascinating history of arguably now the most powerful family in wrestling, the Anoa'is, the Maivias, the Samoan wrestling dynasty.